We had been searching for months, combing through listings and attending countless open houses before we found the one. It was a charming, two-story home on the outskirts of a sleepy little town, nestled among ancient oak trees that twisted their limbs toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The house had a wraparound porch, creaky floorboards that spoke of its age, and a backyard that backed into a dense, shadowy forest. It felt like the perfect place for a fresh start, or so we thought. The day we moved in, the air was heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth. Gray clouds hovered low, casting the house in a dull, oppressive light. My wife, Emma, and I, along with our 8-year-old daughter, Lily, were all eager to unpack and settle in. Even the ominous weather couldn't dampen our spirits. We'd been dreaming of a home like this, a place where Lily could grow up surrounded by nature instead of the concrete and chaos of the city. The first few days passed uneventfully, though the house creaked and groaned more than we were used to. Emma joked that the old place was just stretching its bones. But at night, when the wind rattled the windows and whispered through the trees, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. It was the kind of feeling you get when you're being watched, even when you know you're alone. It started small. On the third night, as I stood at the kitchen sink rinsing a plate, I caught movement in the corner of my eye. I turned to look out the window, expecting to see a raccoon or a deer. Instead, I saw nothing but the dark forest beyond the yard. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I told myself it was just the shadows playing tricks on me. Then came the noises, soft, almost imperceptible at first. A faint tapping on the walls late at night, footsteps creaking on the stairs when everyone was in bed. Emma insisted it was the house settling, but Lily was more candid. "It's the man upstairs," she said one morning at breakfast, her tone as casual as if she were talking about a neighbor. I nearly dropped my coffee mug. "What man?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Lily shrugged. "The one who stands by my door at night. He doesn't talk. He just watches." Emma laughed nervously and brushed it off as a vivid imagination, but I couldn't let it go. That night, I stayed awake, sitting in the dark at the top of the stairs, straining to hear anything out of the ordinary. At around 2 a.m., I heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps coming from Lily's room. My heart pounded as I rushed to her door and flung it open. She was sound asleep, the room empty except for her stuffed animals scattered on the bed. Still, I felt it. The air in the room was thick, suffocating and cold, unnaturally so. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the silence before finally returning to bed. That night, I dreamed of the forest behind the house. In my dream, it seemed alive, its gnarled trees swaying as if whispering secrets to one another. I woke up drenched in sweat. Over the next week, things escalated. Lights flickered unpredictably. Doors slammed shut on their own. The old rocking chair in the living room, a relic left behind by the previous owners, would start swaying even when the air was still. One evening, as I walked past the mirror in the hallway, I saw a figure standing behind me. When I spun around, there was no one there. Yet, the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing day. Emma began to notice it too. She'd come home from work to find cabinets open, dishes shattered on the floor, or muddy footprints leading from the back door to the stairs. We started blaming each other, even though deep down we knew neither of us was responsible. Then, one night, everything came to a head. It was late, well past midnight, and the house was deathly quiet. I was jolted awake by a blood-curdling scream. It was Emma. I ran to our room to find her sitting bolt upright in bed, her face pale and drenched in sweat. "He was here," she whispered, trembling, standing at the foot of the bed. We didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I decided to explore the attic, a space we'd avoided since moving in. Armed with a flashlight, I climbed the narrow, rickety staircase. The attic was cold and smelled of mildew, the dim light from the single window barely piercing the gloom. As I swept the flashlight across the space, something caught my eye. In the far corner, beneath a pile of old tarps, I found a small, weathered trunk. Inside were faded photographs, brittle with age. They were of a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children. But what made my stomach churn was the last photo. It was taken in the very room I stood in, the attic, and the family looked terrified, their faces twisted in fear. Behind them, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure, a man. His eyes burned like coals, and his smile was a jagged slash across his face. I dropped the photo and stumbled back, my chest heaving. As I turned to leave, I felt a presence behind me, cold and suffocating. I didn't dare turn around. I bolted down the stairs, slamming the attic door shut behind me. We moved out the next day. We didn't wait to sell the house or even pack most of our things. We just left, leaving behind the house, the forest, and whatever lurked within its walls. To this day, I still dream of that house, of its creaking floors and shadowed corners. I wake up sweating, the phantom weight of unseen eyes still heavy on me. Whatever was in that house, it wasn't just in the walls. It was in the air, in the very bones of the place. And it wasn't about to let us forget. Moving into a new house is supposed to be exciting, right? A fresh start, new memories to make, all that good stuff. At least, that's what I kept telling myself when my parents decided to uproot our lives and move us to this old, creaky house in a small town. It wasn't exactly my dream, leaving behind my friends and familiar streets, but my parents seemed thrilled about it. The house was interesting. It had this weird charm, like it had been plucked out of a movie where bad things always happen. The paint was peeling slightly on the shutters. The windows rattled in the wind, and there was this massive oak tree in the front yard with branches that clawed at my bedroom window whenever there was a breeze. But the basement, that was on a whole other level of creepy. It smelled damp, like wet concrete and mildew, and it had this low, oppressive ceiling that made it feel like the walls were closing in. My dad had set up some shelves down there for storage, but I made a mental note to avoid that place as much as possible. The first day in the house, I got home from school while my parents were still at work. I was excited to have some alone time, but as I stepped inside, I noticed something off. It was subtle at first, just a faint rhythmic sound coming from below. Thud, thud, thud. I froze. The sound stopped. I told myself it was just the house settling, or maybe pipes. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that had crept up my spine. Over the next few days, the noises continued. It became a pattern. I'd come home from school, toss my bag on the couch, and there it was again. Sometimes it was faint, just a tapping, like someone lightly knocking on the walls. Other times it was louder, like furniture being dragged across the floor. The worst part? It always came from the basement. Always. When I finally told my parents about it, they brushed me off. "You're just stressed," Mom said, waving her hand like she was swatting a fly. "New house, new school. It's a lot to adjust to." My dad, trying to be the practical one, offered to go down and check it out. He came back up a few minutes later, smirking. "Nothing to worry about," he said. "Just a creaky old house. Happens all the time." But I knew what I'd heard, and it wasn't normal. One afternoon, I decided to investigate. My curiosity got the better of me, even though every instinct was screaming at me to leave it alone. I crept down the stairs, flashlight in hand, the wooden steps groaning under my weight. The air grew colder with each step, and by the time I reached the bottom, my breath was visible. The shelves my dad had set up lined one wall, stacked with random boxes and tools. I shone the flashlight around, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out the noises I was hoping to hear. But there was nothing, just shadows and silence. Then, just as I was about to head back up, I heard it. A low, guttural sound, like someone exhaling right behind me. I whipped around, the flashlight beam shaking wildly, but the basement was empty. I bolted up the stairs, 2 at a time, and slammed the door shut behind me. My parents rolled their eyes when I told them. "See?" my dad said. "Stress." The next day, it got worse. I came home from school expecting the usual tapping or dragging noises. But when I stepped into the kitchen, my heart nearly stopped. There was a man standing there. He looked disheveled. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair messy, and his face pale as if he hadn't seen sunlight in months. He froze when he saw me, and for a moment neither of us moved. Then I screamed, loud. He held up his hands, panicking. "Wait! Don't call anyone! Please, I can explain!" he said, his voice trembling. Every nerve in my body told me to run, to grab the phone and call the police. But something about him made me pause. He didn't seem threatening. His eyes were wide, pleading, and there was a desperation in his voice that I couldn't ignore. He told me his name, though I've since blocked it out, and explained that he'd been living in the basement for months. Apparently, after the previous owners sold the house, he hadn't left. He'd carved out a hidden space behind the shelves, where he'd been sleeping and eating scraps he'd managed to gather. When my family moved in, he thought he could stay unnoticed. His story was both horrifying and heartbreaking. He'd lost his job, his family, everything. The house had been his only refuge. I wanted to hate him, to yell at him to get out, but instead I just felt sad. He wasn't some creepy intruder. He was a broken man who'd fallen through the cracks. Against every ounce of logic and reason, I agreed not to tell my parents. He promised he'd leave soon, that he just needed a little more time to figure things out. I knew it was insane, but I couldn't bring myself to throw him out. I'd like to think anyone else in my position would have done the same. The noises have stopped now. The basement doesn't feel quite as ominous as it used to. Sometimes I think about him down there, hiding behind those shelves, and wonder if I made the right choice. But I can't bring myself to tell my parents. Just don't tell my parents. It started with one of those too good to be true Craigslist ads. Room for rent, $400 per month, utilities included. No pets, no loud noises after 10 p.m. I had no choice but to believe it. I was flat broke, my car reeked from weeks of doubling as my bedroom, and payday was still miles away. The room sounded like a miracle. Furnished, utilities included, in a quiet neighborhood. For $400, the universe must have been taking pity on me, or so I thought. The landlord, Mr. Whitaker, was an odd one. Thin as a scarecrow, with eyes that darted around like a bird looking for an escape. He walked with a slight limp, though I never figured out why. When he showed me the house, I was trying to play it cool, but my gut churned at how off it felt. The place was spotless, too spotless, like a model home that no one actually lived in. And then there was the door. It was at the very end of the hallway, taller than any of the others, made from a dark, almost black wood that didn't match the rest of the house. No knob, no hinges, just this solid slab of a door. As I stared at it, I swore I heard something faint, a whisper, or maybe a shuffle, but it was gone almost as soon as I noticed it. "What's behind there?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Mr. Whitaker's expression turned sharp, like I'd hit a nerve. "That's private," he snapped. Then, softening a bit, he added, "The rent's low for a reason. You stay out of there, you'll be fine." Red flag. Oh, definitely. But desperate people don't have the luxury of being picky. I signed the lease and moved in the next day. The first few nights, I convinced myself the house's creepy vibe was just in my head. The silence felt heavier than usual, sure, but it wasn't unbearable. I didn't even think much about the door. That is, until the third night. That's when I first heard the knocking. It wasn't loud, just a faint tap, 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 like fingernails against wood. I sat up in bed, straining to hear, and after a few seconds, it stopped. I told myself it was pipes, or maybe Mr. Whitaker moving around. Nothing to worry about. The next night, the knocking came back, but this time it was accompanied by whispers. At first it sounded like a breeze blowing through cracks in the house. But as I listened closer, I realized it was words. Muted, urgent words. I couldn't make out the language, but the tone, it was pleading. I tiptoed down the hallway, stopping a few feet from the door. The air near it felt colder. My breath misted as I got closer. I leaned in, my ear just inches from the surface, and the whispers stopped. Evan. My name, clear as a bell. I jumped back so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. My skin prickled, my chest felt tight. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I confronted Mr. Whitaker. "What's behind that door?" I demanded. He just stared at me, his face pale and drawn. Finally, he muttered, "I told you to leave it alone. That room. It's not for you." I pushed him for more, but he walked away, shaking his head like he'd already written me off as a lost cause. By the sixth night, it wasn't just whispers or knocking anymore. Now I heard breathing, slow and labored, like someone struggling for air. Sometimes it was right against the door, and other times it sounded like it was moving, pacing. And then the voices started. Not whispers, voices. "Let me out," one begged. A woman's voice, trembling and desperate. "Please, Evan," another whimpered. This time a child. "I'm so cold." By now I was unraveling. My body felt like it was running on fumes. My brain was a tangled mess of paranoia and dread. I knew I should pack my things and leave, but something about that door had its claws in me. I had to know. On the 8th night, when Mr. Whitaker left for his weekly trip to wherever old men go, I made my move. Armed with a crowbar and shaking so hard I could barely hold it, I approached the door. The whispers stopped the moment I touched the wood. The air grew thick, like the house itself was holding its breath. I wedged the crowbar into the edge and pushed. The door groaned as it opened, and what I saw on the other side, I'll never forget it. The room was small, barely more than a closet, and the walls were lined with mirrors. Dozens of them, old and tarnished, their surfaces rippling like water instead of glass. In the middle of the room stood a figure, a man-shaped shadow with no features, just a solid black mass. It turned to face me, or at least I think it did, and suddenly the mirrors erupted. Hands, faces, bodies pressed against the glass from the other side, their screams muffled as they clawed and pounded to get out. "Thank you," the shadow said, its voice a low, vibrating hum. Then it moved, fast. Before I could react, it reached out with a hand that wasn't quite solid but felt like ice against my skin. The pain was instant, like fire shooting up my arm. I screamed and slammed the door shut, throwing my entire weight against it. The house shook. The whispers exploded into a deafening roar, and then silence. When Mr. Whitaker returned, he found me sitting on the floor. My arm burned and blistered where the shadow had touched me. He didn't ask what happened. He just sighed, handed me a beer, and said, "Told you not to touch it." I left that same night, taking nothing but my car keys. A week later, I drove past the house. It was dark, the windows boarded up, the for rent sign gone. I didn't stop. But now, in my new apartment every once in a while, I catch a glimpse of something in the mirror, just a flicker in the corner of my eye. And sometimes, late at night, I hear faint whispers. They still know my name. It was September 3rd, 2023, the day I moved into my new home. The house was built in the early 1900s, a two-story Victorian tucked away in a quiet town in New Hampshire. It was everything I had ever wanted: ornate woodwork, a wraparound porch, and just enough space for me and my dog, Daisy. The price had been suspiciously low, but the realtor chalked it up to the remote location and the house's age. I didn't question it too much. It felt like fate. The first day was uneventful. The weather was perfect, crisp air with a faint smell of autumn leaves. The movers unloaded my boxes, and by evening, Daisy and I were settled in. As night fell, the house creaked and groaned, but I told myself it was just the old wood adjusting to the temperature. By midnight, I was exhausted and went to bed without a second thought. The next morning, I noticed something strange: a small, dusty handprint on the inside of the window in the dining room. It was low, as if a child had pressed their hand against the glass. I didn't have children, and Daisy certainly couldn't leave a mark like that. I rationalized it as something the movers must have done and cleaned it off. On September 5th, I began unpacking in earnest. The house had a peculiar layout. The staircase was narrow and steep, leading to a long hallway with doors on either side. The attic door at the end of the hallway was bolted shut. The realtor had warned me not to bother with it, saying the floorboards up there were unsafe. I didn't question it. The house was old, and that seemed plausible. That night, I woke up around 2:30 a.m. to Daisy growling softly at the bedroom door. She was a sweet, friendly dog and rarely growled, so it put me on edge. I sat up and listened. The house was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. I told Daisy to calm down, and after a while she settled back on the bed. I convinced myself it was nothing. September 6th was stormy. The rain came down in sheets, and the wind howled through the trees like a wounded animal. The power flickered a few times, but never fully went out. I spent most of the day in the living room, reading and trying to ignore the oppressive feeling that seemed to creep in with the storm. The house felt colder than usual, even with the heater on. That evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, I heard footsteps upstairs. They were deliberate, slow, a creak, a pause, then another creak. My heart pounded in my chest. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made my way up the stairs, Daisy close behind me. The hallway was empty and all the doors were shut. I checked each room, finding nothing out of place. The attic door remained bolted. I told myself it must have been the wind. By September 8th, the oddities became harder to ignore. Lights would flicker in rooms I wasn't in. Objects weren't where I'd left them. A book I'd been reading vanished, only to reappear on a completely different shelf 2 days later. Daisy's behavior grew increasingly strange. She would stare at empty corners, her ears pinned back and her tail tucked between her legs. Once, she refused to enter the kitchen at all, growling at something I couldn't see. The breaking point came on September 10th. I was asleep when I was jolted awake by a loud crash downstairs. It sounded like glass shattering. I bolted out of bed, grabbing the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a heavy metal flashlight. Daisy followed me hesitantly, whining softly. When I reached the kitchen, I found the source of the noise. A large glass jar I had placed on the counter was shattered on the floor. But what froze me in place was the word "leave," scrawled into the condensation on the window. The letters were jagged, uneven, as if written by an unsteady hand. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with Daisy, every light in the house turned on. My mind raced with questions. Who or what had done this, and why? The next day, I called the realtor demanding answers. She hesitated before admitting that the house had a reputation. The previous owner had left abruptly, refusing to speak about why. The owner before that had passed away under unclear circumstances. I was furious, but also terrified. I had poured my savings into this house. Leaving wasn't an option. Over the next week, the activity escalated. Shadows moved where no shadows should be. Whispers echoed in empty rooms. One night I woke to find the attic door wide open, the padlock lying on the floor. The air was icy cold and a foul sulfuric smell wafted down from above. I didn't dare go up there. By September 20th, I couldn't take it anymore. The final straw was waking up to find deep scratches on my bedroom door, scratches that hadn't been there the night before. They were long, uneven gouges as if made by something with claws. I packed a bag and left that morning, taking Daisy with me. I've been staying with a friend ever since, trying to figure out what to do. The house still sits there waiting. I haven't been back, and I don't plan to. Whatever is in that house can keep it. Sometimes, I wonder if I'll ever truly escape it. At night, in the silence, I think I can still hear the creaking of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving closer. When I moved into my new house in the countryside, it felt like the start of a peaceful new chapter. The house itself was quaint. A small, weathered cottage, nestled between endless fields and dense woods. It was far removed from the chaos of the city, which was exactly what I thought I needed. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves, the occasional chirp of crickets, and the wind brushing against the old wooden frame. Or so I thought. The first night in my new home was uneventful. The air was crisp, and the soft creak of the wooden floorboards under my feet felt oddly comforting. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, I couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. Moving out here alone was a bold step, but I was ready for solitude, or so I convinced myself. It started subtly. Around midnight, as I was brushing my teeth, I heard it. A faint knock. 3 deliberate taps. I froze, toothbrush suspended midair, my ears straining to catch it again. But the house fell silent, save for the wind whispering through the trees. Must be the wind, I muttered, forcing myself to chuckle. But deep down, I wasn't convinced. Still, I shook it off and went to bed, my heart racing a little faster than it should have. The next night, it happened again. This time it was louder and more distinct, a firm knock on the window by the kitchen. My immediate thought was animals, maybe a raccoon or some curious bird. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, the beam cutting through the inky darkness. The air was eerily still. I scanned the area but found nothing. The dirt near the window pane was undisturbed, not even a paw print. Yet the unease settled deep in my stomach, refusing to budge. By the third night, the knocking was undeniable. It started with the window again, faint but deliberate. Then not 5 minutes later, a knock at the front door. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the door, peering through the peephole. Nothing. No one. Just the soft swaying of the wind chimes hanging on the porch. I swung the door open, flashlight in hand, shining it into the darkness. "Hello," I called, my voice shaky. The silence that greeted me was louder than any reply. Shivering, I slammed the door shut and double-checked the locks. Over the next few nights, the pattern repeated. Knock, window, door. Always at the same time, just past midnight. I stopped sleeping properly. The constant anticipation of the sound kept me wide-eyed. Blankets pulled to my chin. Every time I heard the knocks, I told myself it had to be logical. Animals, trees, maybe even a prank by some bored kid in the area. But none of those explanations felt right. One night, I decided I'd had enough. I set up a chair facing the window where the knocking usually began, armed with my flashlight and phone. Midnight came, and I was ready. When the knock came, sharp and deliberate, I didn't hesitate. I snapped the flashlight on and darted to the window. There was nothing there. The beam of light cut through the glass and into the empty yard. My pulse raced as I waited for the knock on the door, which had become part of the routine. Sure enough, it came. This time I didn't hesitate. I flung the door open, expecting to catch the culprit in the act. The porch was empty. The dirt path leading up to the house was undisturbed, no footprints except my own from earlier. I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise. Something was wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stepped back inside, locking the door behind me, and decided to call the local sheriff the next day. The sheriff arrived the following morning. A man in his late 50s with a calm demeanor, he listened patiently as I recounted my nights of terror. He walked around the property, inspecting the windows, the door, and the yard. "No signs of anyone being here," he said, his brow furrowed. "But it's not unusual to hear things out here. The woods can play tricks on you. Wind knocking branches against the house, animals rustling around. You'd be surprised how loud a raccoon can sound at night." I wanted to believe him, I really did. But as the sun set and the shadows grew longer, the unease crept back in. That night I sat in the living room, lights on, waiting. Midnight came, and so did the knocks. First the window, then the door. My breath caught in my throat as I stood frozen in the middle of the room. This time, something was different. The knocks weren't spaced out like before. They were frantic, insistent, like someone trying to get in. I grabbed the flashlight and crept to the door. My hand hovered over the lock, my body trembling. I wasn't sure if I wanted to open it. Then suddenly, the knocking stopped. The silence was deafening. My heart pounded as I peeked through the peephole, expecting to see nothing, like every other night. But this time, I saw a shadow. Faint, blurry, but unmistakably there. A figure standing just beyond the porch light's reach. I stumbled backward, my hands fumbling to grab my phone. When I looked through the peephole again, the shadow was gone. That was the last night I stayed in that house. I packed up the next morning and left without looking back. To this day, I don't know what was knocking on my door and windows. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was someone playing a sick prank. Or maybe it was something else entirely. All I know is I'll never forget those knocks, or the suffocating sense of dread they carried with them.